Good evening. Well, President Trump's midnight deadline passed, and a 10% tariff on all Chinese imports to the US began at 1 minute past midnight Eastern Time this Tuesday, the 4th of February. Well, the impact of the declaration of this trade war has been felt all over the world. Stock markets in Europe dropped on Tuesday morning as border taxes on Chinese goods coming into the US began, and Beijing started to fire back with tariffs of its own. Well, tonight we examine the impact on both sides of this economic conflict and ask what moves might each side make next. But first, Kate Fisher reports from Washington, D.C.
Guy, as soon as those additional 10% tariffs on Chinese imports went into effect at 1 minute past midnight Eastern Time, well, China immediately responded, putting 15% levies on certain types of coal and liquefied natural gas and 10% duties on crude oil, agricultural machinery, some types of cars and pickup trucks. It also imposed new export controls on critical earth minerals like tungsten, which is vital for making certain tech and defense products, and other critical minerals used for making solar cells. As well as that, it said it would be investigating alleged antitrust violations by the US tech giant Google. But other countries that Donald Trump has said he was going to impose tariffs on, notably Mexico and Canada, 25% tariffs, well, they have had a reprieve for a month, with both of those countries, after telephone calls with President Trump, agreeing to put more border enforcement on their borders with the United States. Mexico saying it would put 10,000 more National Guard troops on its border, and Canada saying it would put 10,000 personnel on its border, as well as agreeing to putting more money and investment on trying to stop the flow of fentanyl and illegal immigrants. But no such reprieve for China. Those tariffs are in place, and we're told that a phone call between President Xi Jinping of China and US President Donald Trump isn't expected until later in the week. Kate Fisher for A News in Washington, D.C.
Fu Kong, China's permanent representative to the United Nations, gave his reaction to the Trump tariff. Speaking at the UN headquarters in New York, he asserted that China is firmly opposed to what he described as an unwarranted increase and raised an official complaint with the WTO. Let's look at those comments now from China's representative.
We are firmly opposed to this unwarranted increase, and we do believe that this is in violation of the WTO rules. So that's why China is filing a complaint at this WTO, and also we may be forced to take countermeasures. And let me also emphasize that there is no winner in a trade war, and we do hope that the U.S. should look at its own problems, really find a solution that is beneficial not only to itself and also to the whole world. And frankly speaking, I don't think that raising tariffs is beneficial to the U.S. itself. Technological containment and technological restriction do not work. I think that is a lesson that the whole world should learn, in particular the U.S. should learn. And I've said this before, and I'm going to say this again. Never, ever underestimate the ingenuity of the Chinese scientists and engineers.
And the concerns in China go far beyond the politicians, economists and policymakers. Let's have a listen now to some of the concerns of Shanghai residents about the escalating trade tensions with the US.
I think the final result is that both sides are hurt. The US has to pay more tariffs, and our product sales abroad will be worse. Because the tariffs are high, the prices are high, so they don't want to buy. For the US, I don't think it's a good thing for the US to follow the unilateralism and influence the international community, because it's not only against China, but also against China, Canada, Mexico, etc. their international relations will also become worse. So I think it would be best if there was a way for the two sides to cooperate. This is also what we are talking about. Of course, it depends on President Trump whether the US is willing to do so.
I have read that China is actually against the US. The US has the price and the increased tariffs, and they are adding some crude oil and other things. And I think the price of gasoline will also rise. Anyway, I think this problem will not be solved in a short time, because the US has to solve all its foreign debt issues. Because it has now signed a lot of bonds, it can't add any more. It can't do without adding any more. So I think if it doesn't solve its own problems, I think the trade war will continue.
For Chinese small and medium-sized manufacturing enterprises, it will definitely have a big impact because their sales in the US may be affected, and then the Americans may go to buy cheaper things as a substitute. People who work in this kind of enterprise will definitely be affected because if the overall income goes down, their wages and daily life will also be affected. And then there may be a series of other chain reactions. But in terms of the relationship between China and the US, I think it is already very bad. I don't think it will be any worse.
Well, our China correspondent Manor Babur has more now on the Chinese perspective.
Well, Guy, China has already taken a number of assertive actions to counter President Trump's tariffs. Let's take a look at what they've done so far. Just today, China has filed a lawsuit with the World Trade Organization against these tariffs while imposing its own tariffs on US products like the LNG, coal, agriculture machinery, and some other products. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce has also rolled out a number of policies that are aimed at increasing and improving China's international trade between its trading partners in the region and globally. We can also see that Chinese manufacturers are accelerating their relocation to other regions like the Middle East, South America, Southeast Asia. And this move of their operations comes as an effort to mitigate or minimize the direct impact of these tariffs on the Chinese exporters. We can also see that Beijing has been robustly strengthening its bilateral ties and global alliances. Just this week alone, we have a lot of regional leaders visiting Beijing, like the President of Pakistan, President of Kyrgyzstan, as well as the Prime Minister of Thailand, are set to visit Beijing this week. We also had the Foreign Minister of India visiting China just a couple of weeks ago. So we can see that China's international relation or international standing has significantly improved since President Trump's last term, and they are economically and diplomatically at a much better position to combat and handle these tariffs. So this back and forth between China and USA is set to continue for a while, and I will keep you updated about it from Beijing, China.
Okay, let's go to Washington now and speak to our very own Obey Sharbanda. Obey, thanks for joining us as always. I want to ask you about the thinking, the strategy behind this trade war, these tariffs. As it stands right now, what do you suppose that President Trump and his team are thinking?
Well, when it comes to tariffs, we know at least Mexico seems to have dodged the bullet. But from what we heard from President Trump in the Oval Office earlier, is that those negotiations are still continuing. Essentially, the president has used the threat of at least a 10% on a tariff on goods from Mexico to try to get some concessions from Mexico. And it looks like following a phone call with Mexican President Sheinbaum, President Trump seems to have been satisfied for now that the Mexicans are going to, one, deploy at least 10,000 Mexican soldiers to the U.S. border to prevent migrants who are streaming in from Latin America, from Mexico's southern border, all the way into its northern border with the United States. And two, following that phone call, President Trump received assurances from Mexico that not only will they crack down on massive illegal migration into the U.S., but they will also crack down on the smuggling of fentanyl. That's the word that you're hearing from President Trump almost on a daily basis. In a press conference in the White House, President Trump said that nearly, or at least over 200,000 Americans are dying a year due to fentanyl overdoses. The president also made clear that it's not over yet. The negotiations with Mexico over tariffs are still ongoing, and he reserves the right to impose those tariffs on Mexico. For now, those 10% tariffs that we were told were imminent have been delayed for at least 1 month. Clearly here, President Trump wants to make sure that the assurances that he's receiving from President Sheinbaum of Mexico on the fentanyl issue and on the illegal migration issue are carried out. And of course, Mexico, alongside with Canada, are America's biggest trading partners. So a 10% tariff by the U.S. on Mexico goods will, for sure, according to economic experts, have a major impact on Mexico's economy. Here, we're seeing President Trump using tariffs and the threat of tariffs to gain major political concessions from Mexico. With Canada, also a major threat on tariffs, including a 10% tariff on Canada's energy exports, which Canada depends upon for its economy. A phone call took place between President Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau, and a follow-on phone call is expected. Those tariffs might also be delayed, just like what we saw with Mexico. Clearly here, some 11th hour negotiating going on between President Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau. China, well, those tariffs are already taking place, and we were already hearing that China is going to pass retaliatory tariffs on the U.S. President Trump, every time he's asked about China and the threat of tariffs on Canada and Mexico, he goes back to the fentanyl issue. Fentanyl is mainly produced in factories in China. Now, interestingly enough, fentanyl is not that China doesn't have a fentanyl problem. The precursor chemicals are produced in China that are then used to that are mixed and then used to produce fentanyl, but they're all exported into Mexico, and then the cartels then produce this chemical, and then they mix it with drugs that are then exported to the U.S. Very deadly chemical, very highly toxic. And so the U.S. has long been pressing Beijing on this issue. President Trump clearly does not believe that Beijing is doing enough on fentanyl. And another major issue, that we're seeing, come up time and time again with the president, he does not believe that some of America's biggest trading partners, including China, Mexico, and Canada, are treating American companies fairly. And that from his perspective, why should the U.S. offer its massive market, America being the world's largest economy, to these countries if they are also not offering similar access to their markets for American companies? President Trump, I've been to multiple campaign rallies, during President Trump's campaign for the presidency, where he would always ask the audience, "What's my favorite word in the English dictionary?" And he would respond, "Tariffs." Clearly, tariffs going to be a driving factor here in President Trump's foreign policy moving forward.
And Obey, we've had the trade war initiated. We've had the tariffs, the threat of tariffs. What is next in terms of the strategy for President Trump and his team?
Yeah, it's clearly the threat of tariffs being imposed by the United States is a motivating factor. We saw it work with Colombia, for instance. In a matter of 24 hours, President Trump threatened crippling sanctions on that country that largely depends on American trade if Colombia does not accept repatriation flights of Colombian citizens who were captured by American law enforcement for being illegal immigrants in the U.S. The U.S. had transported a number of those illegal migrants to Colombia via a military transport flight. The Colombian president went on social media saying he will not accept these flights. He would not accept the U.S. military transporting illegal migrants or citizens of Colombia on these military flights. Washington, President Trump made it very clear that if there isn't, a resolution to that issue, there will be a swift response. And then we saw a deal being made within 24 hours. with that country and everything has gone back to normal. So that seems to be the strategy here. Is very swiftly moving with the threat and the of the imposition of these tariffs. Look, the White House press secretary on This Weekend said that these tariffs were coming. This was going to happen, and it wasn't until the very last minute, literally at the 11th hour, that Mexico negotiated a deal that at least temporarily has put a pause, not a halt, on the potential imposition of these tariffs. I think, moving forward, you're going to see negotiations between President Trump and Xi Jinping. We heard from President Trump earlier that he does expect to speak with the head of the Chinese government, Xi Jinping, in the coming days, perhaps today. And another round of negotiations will be taking place between President Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau. And I think you're going to see also the European Union. That's going to be another major issue, with President Trump over the weekend saying that the EU has not been fair for American companies, and trade practices have left the U.S. in a massive deficit compared to European Union trading partners. So I think moving forward, you're going to see President Trump really focus in on potential tariffs in the EU and on China. I think the plan here is to at least elicit major concessions when it comes, on China's case, to fentanyl, in the European Union to what President Trump believes to be unfair trade practices. But look, it's, we're not out of the woodworks yet when it comes to tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Tariffs on those countries, including China, will also potentially have an impact on the American economy. So I think moving forward, you can expect a very similar sort of 11th hour negotiation tactics from President Trump. But he's not bluffing, and I think these countries realize that President Trump is not bluffing. We saw that reaction this weekend when, the U.S. was at the very last moment prepared to implement these sanctions, and only then did we see real movement by the president of Mexico on the fentanyl issue and illegal migration. So I think you can expect multiple rounds of negotiations, and what everyone here in Washington is really looking at is how will those talks between President Trump and Xi Jinping take place, and will there be a similar 11th hour resolution as we saw with Mexico? It's a much different dynamic, Washington-Beijing relationships, as compared to Washington and Mexico. President Trump said that he has a good relationship with both Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada and with President Sheinbaum of Mexico. But as he said, hey, just because I like them doesn't mean that we will still not impose tariffs. China, is Premier Xi Jinping may not be so readily willing to back down, and certainly he has his image as a strong leader that he wants to protect. So I think moving forward, those negotiations between President Trump and Xi Jinping, that the whole world is going to look at how those talks end up impacting the entire global economy, because American tariffs on China and retaliatory Chinese tariffs on the U.S. will certainly impact global markets.
Obey, thank you very much indeed. Obey Sharbanda in Washington there for us. Well, that is all we have time for on this edition of News Hour. Please do stay with us for plenty more news and analysis. And from all of us here in Baku, we wish you a pleasant evening ahead.